Hello and welcome back to the second module in the training series for the National Local Communications Media Campaign of Awareness for Local Community Development Committees. This module is focused on stakeholder engagement. And the module objectives are to identify the types of stakeholders and their level of influence on policy and planning, understanding the importance of stakeholder engagement, overview of the consultation methodology, identifying the barriers to inclusive engagement with stakeholders, overview of best practice principles to allow for inclusive engagement and consultation. So stakeholders, any individual or group or organisation that can affect or is affected by the LCDC decisions, policies or actions. In local development, this includes people who live, work or provide services in the community. Stakeholders provide local knowledge, community priorities and feedback for planning and decision making. Types of stakeholders within any community are the following. So your primary stakeholders are local residents, community groups, service users, target groups within local communities. That could be older people, young people, migrants, travelling community, people with disabilities, people that are requiring services and supports within the communities. Typical role in terms of being a stakeholder is that they're directly affected by decisions and programs that are delivered within their community. Secondary stakeholders are NGOs, charities, advocacy networks, public participation networks or PPNs, and their role is to support or represent the community interests. Then you have institutional stakeholders, which include local authorities, the local development companies, organisations like HSE, education training boards, state agencies, the Gardaí, TUSLA, etc. And their typical role is to deliver or fund services and shape policy. And then the last category is the private sector and funders. So there would be local businesses, credit unions, banks, social enterprise and philanthropic growth groups. And their role is to provide resources, funding, and to support organisations under their corporate social responsibility. So when we're asked to look at stakeholders within communities and work with organisations who are doing stakeholder consultation, we need to identify first of all in terms of what are the stakeholders that are crucial to the process, what stakeholders are part of or integral to the planning process, and who will be impacted mostly by the decisions that are being made in relation to projects or programs. So we use a power interest matrix. So you have organizations who have, or individuals who have a low level of interest and who have a low level of power, and you have organizations who have, and individuals who have a high level of interest and a high level of power. So when we're looking at developing our stakeholder consultation policy or our strategy, we look at the various different groups within an organization or within the community, the various different organizations within communities, and individuals we want to target. So, for example, you might have a project where you're looking to engage with every stakeholder across the community. I might look at your maybe local business or local residents, and some of those residents might be directly involved in the community initiative, or they might be directly impacted by it. So therefore, they might be aware of it, but they don't really have huge interest, and they don't really have any power in relation to the output or the outcomes of that project. So, for example, you might have a couple or individuals who are moving to a new community for the first time. They don't have any links to the community. They don't have any maybe kids at the moment in the community. So therefore, they're not really that engaged in the local school, the local sporting clubs or organizations. You might have local businesses who feel that they might be directly impacted by the projects or the services. So therefore, they're aware of things, but they might have any interest or low level of interest and low level of power. So when we're looking at stakeholder engagement, we will monitor them, we keep them informed, let them know what's going on. They can get engaged if they want to, they can participate if they want to, or they don't have to. You have other organizations then who have a low level of interest because they're not directly impacted by the projects themselves directly on the ground, but they have a high level of power. That would be government departments. So government departments who are making decisions nationally, civil servants who are working in government departments who are looking at strategy, looking at policy, looking at funding programs and funding streams. They're not directly involved in those projects on a local level, at ground level within communities, but obviously they hold a lot of power because they're the ones coming up with these strategies. Statutory agencies, the charity regulator, for example, is a good example of an organisation that has a high level of power, but it wouldn't be directly involved in the day-to-day operational side of projects on the ground, and wouldn't be that directly involved in the delivery of projects or services on the ground. You might elect representatives who have a remit for their local community or for the wider county. So they have a high level of power, but their level of interest will be low depending on the type of project or their direct involvement with that project within that community. So when we're looking at, again, stakeholder engagement with that type of groupings, we would keep them satisfied in terms of making sure that they're engaged, making sure that we're responding to their requirements, we're reporting to them, we're involving them from an early stage of the process. Organizations that would have a high level of interest and have a high level of power are typically your funding organizations, your local authority in each county, local development companies that are responsible maybe for the rollout of the funding programs, or supporting organizations in terms of supporting the community in terms of maybe animation programs, your PPN in terms of directly linked to the local community. So they'll be managed closely because they're key to the actual overall success and the delivery of the programs. So they're crucial to be involved in the very beginning and throughout the process. Other organizations and individuals who have high level of interest because they're directly impacted by the project or program or the funding, but who don't really have a lot of power because they're not at the decision-making level, or they're not involved in the implementation of it, but they're involved in the delivery in terms of the impact, would be things like local groups and clubs, so community volunteer organizations, sports clubs, schools, marginalized groups, and volunteers within communities who would be directly impacted by these projects, and obviously you need to be engaged with at an early stage, so the programs that are being developed or projects being developed are aligned to their requirements and needs, and they reflect their needs and their requirements, and they're designed around those needs and requirements. So that it's important their engagement at the very beginning and that they're brought along the entire process. And it's also important their engagement in terms of evaluating the programs and projects, so that the feedback in terms of impact and the outcomes of the projects on the ground are being reported back from the people who are being directly impacted by or not impacted by the programs. So why stakeholder engagement really matters in the community volunteer sector? First of all, it kind of gives legitimacy and trust. So when you're engaging with people from the outset in relation to planning, like for example, a local economic community plan, in relation to county development plan, in relation to any project or in relation to any study or work that's been done within your community, it gives a level of transparency and it makes people accountable. It does lead to better policy and outcomes because obviously the stakeholders are giving their opinion based on their lived experience and their insights and their knowledge of the local community. They're the ones that are identifying the needs. They're the ones identifying the gaps in services and delivery of services. They're the ones that are identifying the issues and problems, and also, I suppose, the strengths within the community also. And based on the feedback and the lived experience of people living and working and volunteering in the community, that always leads to better policy and better outcomes for those projects. It's all about social inclusion, so it's about engaging people, helping people that are marginalized or underrepresented within communities, give them the opportunity to be included in the planning process, be included in the implementation plans for various different projects and programs, not just the ones that directly impacting them, but also other programs, also the wider planning for within communities. It's about partnership working, so engaging with your stakeholders from the outset and throughout the process builds relationships, it builds that networking, and it does lead to shared responsibilities for outcomes in relation to these programs and projects across the community. And finally, it's very important that stakeholders, people living, working, volunteering that are involved in the local community, organizations that are responsible for delivery of services and programs within the local community, that they all feel that they have ownership of these local plans and actions. So it's not a case of the community thinking, plans are being developed without their involvement, plans are being developed, behind closed doors. It's important that they feel that they're being involved from the outset. And once those projects are being delivered on the ground, funding comes into place, services being delivered, the community feel that they've an ownership of those, and they're going to respond to it and they're going to support it longer term, which leads to the sustainability of those projects, programs and services in the future. So how can stakeholders influence plans and decision making? It's key to looking at identify what priorities are within a community. So unless people engage with their clients, their customers, service users, people that will be directly impacted by services or by facilities or by funding programs or by support programs, they're the ones that are influencing the decisions, they're the ones influencing the plans, because they're the ones presenting the needs and highlighting the needs. They do system policy design, so they shape the objectives, for example, of the local economic community plan, and other social inclusion strategies. Because again, those objectives are focused on targeting supports to where they're needed, and those supports and those needs can only be identified through engaging with the people on the ground that are going to be benefiting from this, and the people that are going to be delivering and implementing those projects. They influence the implementation. So in a lot of cases, you have co-delivery projects, so organizations working together in the delivery of projects. So again, based on the HCDC structures, where you've got collaboration and partnership working with the various different organizations, stakeholders, community, public, private sector representation on those HCDCs, it's important that the projects are being delivered in a collaborative way. It's about increasing the opportunities for volunteering, for partnerships, in the implementation of programs on the ground. The stakeholders who are involved from the beginning through the implementation stage are crucial to the monitoring and evaluation of the programs and initiatives, and to look at are the actions being implemented properly, are the objectives being achieved, is there an impact there, what's the impact and the positive impact impacts on the ground. That only comes from people that are benefiting from the programs and delivery of those programs, and providing feedback on the effectiveness of those programs as well. So any project, any program cannot be monitored, cannot be evaluated unless there's ongoing engagement and feedback and consultation with people that are directly involved in the implementation of the programs, but also, more importantly, the people that are benefiting from those programs or are not benefiting, depending on the case. So the consultation method. So most of you, if not all of you, that are involved in this module or looking at this module would have been involved in some level of consultation, either facilitating the consultation process, implementing consultation processes, or being on the side where you're giving your input on a consultation process. So I'm going to go through the various different methods that we work with when we're doing community plans, village plans, or working on projects with local community volunteer organisations, local development companies, or local authorities. So the first, I suppose, and the kind of go-to, and the one that most people are familiar with, would be surveys and questionnaires. These can be postal surveys, on-street surveys, so people on the street with clipboards doing things like maybe traffic counts, footfall analysis, getting opinions and attitudes of people that are living in the area, working in the area, that are visiting the area. Surveys are carried out in public meetings or public forums, and then online surveys using tools like SurveyMonkey, Google Forms, where you're targeting a wider market or wider remit or wider number of people than your local community. So I suppose the pros of surveys is that it can be very, very quick. It can be very inclusive because it can go to everyone, and everyone's got the opportunity to complete those surveys and forms. It's very good at gathering quantifiable data, and data in terms of demographic information. Online surveys are very, very good for trying to target a wider audience, so targeting maybe expats, people that have left the community, living maybe in other parts of the country, or have moved abroad and living abroad, and it's getting their opinions in terms of, and giving them the opportunity to have an impact or have a say in their plans for their community or their home or their village or parish. I suppose the disadvantages or cons would be that the response rates can be poor when it comes to surveys, especially postal surveys, and even with online surveys. Online surveys might be suitable for everyone because people just sometimes are wary of completing surveys online, or they're not tech savvy, or just don't have access to technology. Surveys can be very much biased in terms of the interpretation of the answers, or in some cases, if the surveys aren't designed properly, the questions can be very leading, which leads to the wrong questions being asked. And again, if the surveys are being analysed and interpreted by third parties, sometimes their biases can kind of influence the analysis of those surveys. Community meetings and town halls, again, excellent way of gathering data, gathering feedback, and engaging with the community and giving the community an opportunity to have their say and get involved. It's also a very good way of informing the community of what's happening, of projects and programs, and giving people an idea of what the process to date has been, what the timeline for future initiatives and activities within the project is going to be, or the planning process, whatever it might be. So the advantages, it's public forum. It does give people an opportunity to get involved. It allows people to provide information in different formats. It allows for open discussion. So again, at a public meeting, you can have open discussion. If it's facilitated properly, the facilitator can encourage discussion, can encourage engagement. Typically, if you have a public meeting where you break it down to maybe working groups within the meeting or within the forum, where it gives people opportunity to kind of discuss and brainstorm ideas in a smaller kind of group level, and then maybe feed that back to a wider audience. That works really, really well when it comes to community planning, for example. The advantages of community meetings, town halls, it does require facilitation, and I suppose it's really important. It's a good facilitator that can manage a crowd and facilitate a process where it's run on time, it's run to an agenda, not one person's overtaking and kind of is talking a lot when others aren't talking at all. Sometimes it does favor people who are more confident. People who are confident and able to stand up and talk in front of people, or more confident doing that, will come to the forefront. Maybe other people who have a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, and maybe have a huge amount of input, but are just wary or not comfortable delivering that in an open forum. Not every group may be represented, so you often find within community meetings or public meetings, not every one of the people within the community are represented at that. So in our experience, the amount of young people attending public meetings or community meetings is really very, very low in our experience across the country. So you might have representation from younger people in the community, and therefore their voice isn't heard at that forum. Some of the, I suppose, the type of community planning we would have done in the past is around kind of participatory planning or planning for real. It's very, very useful for things like, say, for town and community planning, or when you're looking maybe developing infrastructure plans, or maybe facilities planning for communities or estates or areas within a town, or sports organizations that are maybe developing facilities plans. So that gives people it's a very practical way of getting people involved, where they can highlight where certain things need to go, where they like to see certain facilities or infrastructure or whatever. And it's using kind of the mapping process, or using things like diagrams or charts, or even kind of miniature kind of models of facilities or whatever infrastructure within the town. The kind of advantage, I suppose, really is that it does require very good facilitators. Timing is important. The venue is important. Key issue, I suppose, really with kind of planning for real type of plan, kind of consultation process, where people are very much engaged in the actual planning process, and kind of highlighting where things should be going within a community in terms of infrastructure or whatever. It can lead to heightened expectations. So people might say, look, we want a shopping centre in the local village, we want a cinema, we want a swimming pool, we want tennis courts, we want bowling alleys, we want all these things. And sometimes obviously they're not possible, or they're not practical, or it will never happen. So it's very important that expectations are kind of checked at the very beginning. People's ideas and opinions are obviously accepted, and people can give their opinions and ideas, but it's all within, I suppose, the constraints of what's possible and what funding is available as well. Focus groups, in my experience, work really, really well, and is an excellent way of working with specific groups within communities, because you can target your focus on various different groups depending on their needs and requirements, and you can adjust the methodology, and you can adjust the approach you're taking with the various different groups. So it's one of the best methods for gathering qualitative data, because you're getting feedback and real kind of rich data back from people that are being directly impacted by, or will be directly impacted by, the various different projects or plans. Focus groups can be targeted for different groups, and allows for more diverse range of input. Where we see work very well is we work with young people. So you go into schools or maybe clubs, and you get the input of young people in their own environment where they're comfortable. Maybe bring in, looking at maybe some peers to come in and maybe facilitate that process with you, and asking them for their opinions and their ideas. So we would work maybe with national schools, and they might use things like the planning for real process, where they're actually writing their ideas on paper, they're drawing out sketches of what would happen or should happen, or what they'd like to see happen in their community, and they get involved in it. So it works very well with things like, say, planning for things like playgrounds, for play areas, even in public realm projects, certainly with things like, say, sports facilities or play facilities within communities. Getting their input is very, very important. Things like skateboard parks, you talk to the skaters. Things like, if you're developing a playground, you talk to the kids in there, because they're the ones using it. Adults don't know what's fun in the playground. Kids do, so talk to the kids about it. If you work with older people, people with disabilities, representatives from the traveling community, again, you're getting their opinions, their ideas, their real life experiences. The disadvantage, I suppose, of using focus groups and working with focus groups is very time consuming because you're working with a number of different groups, but you are going to get better, more targeted data back and more real information that you can use when it comes to planning, when it comes to developing projects, and it's worth spending that time in relation to things like the local economic community plan or any other planning process that you're going through. It's important the time is spent to make sure that you're getting the ideas, you're looking at all angles, you're getting input from everyone within the community, so you've got a holistic approach to the whole thing rather than saying, okay, well, I think this is going to work well from my perspective, but that might work well from the person who's actually going to benefit from it or be impacted by it. Other methods then that we would use and other organizations use, again, it's using like the whole area of digital and online and social media. So where you have an online forum, for example, where people can give their input, or even maybe email submissions back to organizations in relation to people's opinions and what they feel is relevant. Webinars, where again you can maybe do kind of a wider scale information session on a program. Again, that works really well for maybe again town planning, community planning. Using social media campaigns more from an informational point of view, where you're giving people information around the process or the planning process or what's happening and giving people more of an update and keeping them engaged. So social media works really well when you're engaging with people over a long period of a process, from a planning process, or if it's a project from the very beginning of the project to the planning stage, implementation stage, to the evaluation stage. So it's engaging with them throughout that process. So you would see clubs doing that, for example, with their members and with the wider community, where they're updating their social media posts and giving people updates in terms of where the project is at. That might be from a funding perspective in terms of how they're reaching their targets in terms of funding, in relation to maybe the work that's been done. So they might give updates in terms of the building process or infrastructure improvements, whatever it might be. And that's getting people engaged. People, it's transparency, people know what's going on, they know their money's being spent, they can see tangible outcomes of the money that's been raised locally. That's really, really important. Storytelling and creative methods. So again, we would see groups, we've worked with groups who use things like art, photography, exhibitions, using like things like local media, like local newspaper, local radio, community notes, online newsletters, parish newsletters. Again, where they're engaging with the community, they're keeping the community informed about what's happening, and they're looking maybe for the community's feedback. You can see there in one of the images where some organizations would use things like, say, construction hoarding around a building site or a project being developed, where they use that to maybe kind of put a kind of maybe timeline or historical timeline or information on the project, or maybe information on the community, or kind of the rationale behind what the project's going to be or what the project's going to look like. So it's a very visual thing. Again, a lot of clubs will do that when it comes to maybe infrastructure projects, where they might have billboards with information about the project, might have 3D imagery there in terms of what the project's going to look like when it's completed. So people driving by know what's going on, they know what's happening, they feel more engaged because they are being engaged, they are being informed. And when it comes to looking for funding, for example, or you're fundraising locally, people know what the fundraising is for, they know what the outcome is going to be because they can see it visually in front of them in terms of a 3D or a presentation or a billboard or whatever it might be. Just these are simple ways. Doesn't have to cost a lot of money, doesn't have to be very, very expensive. Just common sense ways of how we can engage better with our community, how do we get in front of them, how do we talk to them, keep it very informal. The more informal it is, the better, the more open people are going to be in terms of giving their opinions and views. But make sure that everyone has an opportunity. Not everyone will want to get involved, not everyone will want to give their opinion, not everyone will want to actually have anything to do with it. But you give people the opportunity. If they don't want to, that's fine, but you give them the opportunity to do so if they want to. It's very important that when we're talking about community engagement, that we look at inclusivity. It's, as I said, it's really, really important that people, everyone within the community, whether it be a small village, a larger village, a large town, or an entire parish, or an entire county, or even nationally, that people have the right to give their opinion, have their opinion listened to, and it is very important that people have the opportunity to engage. And it's very important that when you're looking at this engagement process or strategy, that you are looking at how we can make it as inclusive as possible. There is a guide to inclusive engagement in local planning that's available online. That again is worth downloading and looking at to make sure that when you're developing your stakeholder engagement process and strategy, that you are complying with national policy around inclusive engagement. Some of the barriers that we come across, things like physical access. Public meetings being held in venues that are accessible to people in wheelchairs or who have mobility impairment. I live in County Kerry. It's a large county. If a meeting is held in Tralee, that could be 2 hours away from parts of South Kerry. So people just don't have access there. We don't have a huge public transport system. So if it's very, very far, people will find, well, I can't get there, therefore I can't get involved. I can't be engaged. But a big common thing would be a lot of these things are held in, say, community venues where they might be accessible. That excludes people with disabilities. And if it's only in one area, it can also maybe exclude rural residents living far away from that location. Language and literacy is another issue. So, we're all guilty of it, and we all understand that a lot of documents that we read are very complex. They're written in maybe not as very easy to read English. We have a lot of documentation in English only. So for new communities, people coming to Ireland for the first time, they might have a great grasp of the English language. They'll find it difficult to engage and get involved. So it does exclude migrants and does exclude low literacy participation as well, which is a huge issue for a lot of people. Digital exclusion. So some groups are very much focused on digital, so social media, online forums, which is it's obviously it's less time consuming, it's less expensive, but if people don't have access to devices, if people aren't connected, they don't have access to broadband, or just they don't use mobile technologies or digital technologies, therefore they don't have opportunity to get involved. That does exclude older people, primarily in communities, or low-income groups, or people just living in areas with poor broadband would be an example of that. Representation. So again, we would see a lot of consultation in the past where people that should be involved in a process are maybe represented at that meeting. That could be being at public meetings or engagement process where there's been projects around maybe people with disabilities, but yet there's no one in the room with a disability. There's no one involved in the process that has disability. Yes, there might be someone that is representing people with disabilities, but there's no one there with the actual disability. I've been involved in traveller projects in the past where we know representation from the travelling community at the initial preliminary meetings, again, which doesn't make any sense, but that's what happens. I've been at meetings where we've been involved in the development of facilities for younger people, but yet there's no young people involved in the initial stages of the process. So that limits input then from the marginalised groups and marginalised communities, and it doesn't give you a clear understanding of the issues that are facing them or their needs that they're coming across every day. Time and location can be another issue. So again, meetings during working hours, if people are working, they can't attend meetings because they're work. So if someone's working, if they're caring for someone else, again, locations, as I said, is another issue. Venues are very important. If you are looking at a wider county-wide planning process, your public meetings have to be held in various different locations around the county, so people have access to it locally, not traveling for miles to get to one public meeting about a planning process at county level. It should be delivered across the county in different locations. So inclusive engagement principles that we would follow would, again, use plain English, use visual materials where possible, provide interpretation and translation where it's relevant. So again, if you've got people with hearing impairments, if you've got people who don't speak English as their first language, you need to make sure that that's being interpreted for them or translated for them. Hold meetings at accessible venues and times. Do an accessibility audit of all the venues you're using. Make sure that every aspect of those facilities are accessible, from car parking to entrances to toilet facilities. Partner with trusted community organisations. So again, it's very important that if you're trying to target, marginalised groups or hard to reach groups, that you're working with organisations who are working with those organisations or working with those groups or individuals on the ground. That could be youth organisations, schools, sports clubs, travel organisations, disability organisations, family resource centres, etc. So any organisations already working with has the trust of those community or the trust of those individuals, partner with them, maybe get them to facilitate the process of the initial engagement with them. Again, look at access to childcare and transport links. So again, we will see some public meetings held in family resource centres where there's childcare on site. We would see groups organising public meetings in locations where there is local transport links, so there might be local link route in that area, and they would make sure that there's a venue that's on that route, so people have actually access to public transport to that area to get a bus to the public meeting. And again, it's making sure that you're adapting the public sector equality and human rights duties and their guidelines in terms of inclusive practice. So it is a statutory obligation on public bodies in the performance of their functions to have regard to the need to eliminate discrimination, promote equality of opportunity, and protect human rights of staff and service users. So in conclusion, effective community and stakeholder engagement is essential to the success and the credibility of LCDCs, ensuring that local priorities are informed by lived experience and real community need. Meaningful consultation strengthens trust, improves the quality of decisions, and builds shared ownership across partners, helping programs and actions to be better targeted, more inclusive, and more sustainable in the long term. That concludes the second module and of the National Local Campaign of Awareness for Local Community Development Committees. I'd like to thank you for participating in this module, and thank you again for supporting your local community.